Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I am a big advocate of that story, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, but I will actually cast the does not masturbate on Zoom stone. Like, that is not something that I think people in general do. Unless there's anything else that you want to say before we do.
No, my mind is already clicked over, Spence. I can't return to anything. Yes, sublime.
You are like, do you know Up That Dog, where it's like, you are my master and I love you, squirrel? Like, that's what it is.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Now
Toobin
is the Jeffrey Toobin subject, and you're like, squirrel. Welcome back to the Roundtable. This is another Spencer Klavan hosting, David Barr interlocutor edition. This is becoming like a kind of regular special. I like it. This is like the special Klavan and Barr episodes of the Roundtable when we kick everybody else out. And yeah, people are traveling. People are tied up with other commitments, and we're holding down the fort here as per usual, as is our want. I'm very excited. These are always super fun episodes. I'm Spencer Klavan, the assistant editor of The American Mind. I'm here with David Barr, the managing editor of The American Mind. Hey, David.
Hey, Spencer. How are you?
I'm great, man. I'm very excited. There's a lot to talk about this week, and we are a day out from the next debate. We're one day before the debate. When you're hearing this, you might actually either be about to watch the debate, or you might already have seen it. Mm-hmm. Right now, when we're recording, it's the day before the debate. And so a lot of this episode, I feel like, is just going to be us discussing kind of the state of play going into this end game. I've been feeling for a while like there's all these news stories. I mean, 2020 is just an endless stream of news stories. There's literally one news story after another. And so, as usual, there are a million things going on. But it does sort of feel like a lot of the stories are like people talking about stuff, thinking about stuff, doing crazy things, and less, this event that will drastically affect the election, with one exception which we're going to talk about. But I just feel as if, this is a little bit what qualifies as the calm before the storm, because we really are about, Matt talks about going over the waterfall, or boss Matt Peterson talks about, we're really heading for the last stretch of this insane season. And so we thought it would be a good chance in this episode to just chat about and take stock of everything that's going on. And the place we want to start really is with a kind of update on the New York Post Hunter Biden expose / Twitter censorship scenario, because we briefly, I think, touched on this last week. I think it was out and available to talk about last week. But there have been some insane developments. I mean, it's almost impossible to believe sometimes that you're living in this timeline. And we need to kind of catch ourselves up on what's going on and talk about what it means. So this all starts with a New York Post expose regarding Hunter Biden's emails. So the son of Joe Biden, whom you may recall from that fun musical, The Democrat Runs for Congress. Runs for president, excuse me. So Joe Biden, as we have now said ad nauseum, is the Democrat candidate for president. He's running against Donald Trump, and his son, Hunter, has always been a liability. I mean, this is not, that part of it is not news. He's always been kind of a shady character. We knew, I mean, back in the day, if you can remember thousands of years ago when they impeached Donald Trump over that nothing burger of a story, that he was kind of asking Ukraine for deets about Hunter Biden's involvement. That's what this was about. It was about Hunter, like, maybe doing dirty deals with Ukrainian business people, with Ukrainian politicians, maybe selling influence for Joe while he was VP. And Trump was trying to uncover this. And as usual, when a Republican uncovers a scandal, the press reacts as if the true scandal is the Republican trying to uncover. How did you get this information? And that's the impeachment was almost like the apotheosis of that phenomenon. It was like a whole impeachment based on how dare you ask into this sort of quite plausible theory of democratic corruption, that maybe Hunter Biden is influence peddling for his father. Joe has studiously and openly denied this. So the stakes of this are, if it turns out that Hunter was accepting money in exchange for some kind of influence in Ukraine or some kind of Ukrainian interaction even with Joe Biden, if that's true, then Biden nakedly lied to cover up some kind of corruption in that dimension. And so the Post came out and said, we've got this cache of emails. Among them is a line in an exchange between Hunter and a Ukrainian business person saying that they can meet Joe if they pay, I think it's $10 million. That would be bombshell enough. But very quickly, the story became a studious attempt to keep this developing story out of the public eye. And I'm going to state at the outset what I believe is my view on this, which is it is genuinely what you call a developing story. I mean, we're waiting. We're waiting to hear exactly what this is, how serious it turns out the corruption was, and also, to what extent was Joe aware of everything that was going, all the madness that's going on with Hunter, all that stuff. All that stuff is, in the old days, that would have been called a developing story, meaning the actual journalists are on it trying to uncover the truth, and eventually we'll get to it. Instead, what has happened is major sources of news in the digital era, namely Twitter and Facebook, have decided on the basis of complaints by people like Kyle Griffin, who is a Times reporter who tweeted that this is disinformation and it shouldn't be discussed or raised in polite company. It's something that shouldn't be spread because it constitutes a kind of, information hack, an unmaking of our truth-telling mechanisms. Because of that, Twitter and Facebook took steps to slow the spread, as it were, of this story. And in Twitter's case, it went so far as the impossibility of sharing the link. You couldn't tweet the link on Twitter. You couldn't DM the link. This was the most remarkable thing to me. You couldn't send it over direct message, private message. And on Facebook, similar things were true. And then, and this is the kind of ongoing part of it, is that the New York Post, a major American news outlet,
founded by Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, David. It's founded by Alexander Hamilton, has been locked out of Twitter for days now. I mean, going on a week. And so we are now really seeing the end game of what big tech censorship will look like in the last days before the election. I mean, this is them showing their hand, and they've made all sorts of excuses for themselves about, well, we can't be sharing things that aren't verified. And Twitter's thing was that this wasn't information that was obtained from an authorized source, which of course is an excuse that would apply in any sane world to the Steele dossier, the entire basis of the Russian collusion hoax, right? And to a bunch of other stuff that's openly shared on Twitter and Facebook. So that's, nakedly partisan. Always with these things, they come up with some explanation. It's like this stuff only, these kinds of misunderstandings only happen with conservatives. So that's where we're at. I mean, we're at a place where the excuses for censoring conservatives are more and more pro forma, more and more obviously cynical. And the reality is that conservatives are fighting against massive monopoly, almost monopoly holding corporations that are how we get our information, as we try to uncover what's going on in this whole scenario. Bar, I'm gonna hand this over to you, and I want to ask how calculated and how coordinated do you think this all is? Because we were talking before we started recording about, like, it was leaked that in the Borat sequel, this is, My Name is Borat, the Sacha Baron Cohen joint, where he kind of entraps people in making fools of themselves. It was leaked that maybe Rudy Giuliani puts his hand down his pants in an interview with an underage reporter, which of course it's a sting operation. And also Giuliani, he said, I'm tucking my shirt in. It's all a hoax. And so we don't really know what's going on with that, but it was released in this very convenient way because Giuliani has been a major player in unveiling the Hunter emails. how much do you think that this is coordinated, and how much do you think it's just the kind of implications of people's philosophies playing themselves out?
Oof, that's a good question. It's hard to suspect it's not coordinated. But in the end, I don't think I don't think there's a terrible difference. You said that they were tipping their hand. Did you say you said they were kind of tipping their hand, big tech, that is,
Yeah.
on what they mean to do in the future? I would phrase it. I agree with you. I'd say that they are testing the waters. So this, to me, reads as a trial. So here are my thoughts. When Twitter and Facebook, but in particular Twitter. So again, to remind listeners, in case you missed it, when Spencer said it, the New York Post is still frozen out of their ability to tweet out articles. And since today, the news is consumed by people, the majority of it is consumed online or on the phone, on your phone to be particular specific. It's all traded through social media platforms. So this is the bread and butter. This is the vitally important to any news outlet. And so Twitter has choked that off. And I think that conservatives, the Senate GOP in particular, talked tough when this first happened, but have, I think, failed in reacting swiftly and with energy to kind of combat this censorship. And so the unfortunate message this sends players like Twitter and Facebook is, hey, next time you guys want to do it, especially if it's under a favorable administration like the Harris administration, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. So what we're going to do first is we'll try and hit the New York Post. They're widely read, but it won't ruffle as many feathers as, say, National Review or somebody that'll get really, really loud. And so you have Sohrab Ahmari, a friend of the American Minds and Claremont's. He'll hem and haw, but we'll kind of ignore him, and we're just going to ignore this New York newspaper. But I think that you have any editorial board that dares cross the zeitgeist of the time, it can be shut down. It's so simple, and it's a terrible. I think what's shocking to me is that journalists, it's either they're dishonest or they're stupid or some combination of the two, aren't condemning this. I just don't understand how, as a class, a self-interested class, irrespective of ideological lines, as a self-interested class, they aren't trying to protect one another from what Silicon Valley is doing, because it's just it'll come for them one day too.
There's something really important in what you're saying, I think, about just exactly where the Post sits in our media landscape, because I think the answer to your question about what are they expecting will happen is they're genuinely very naive. About this, they genuinely don't think that the revolution will come for them. Long ago, I can't remember when it was, and shamefully, I can't even remember if it was the Onion or the Babylon Bee. I think it must have been the Babylon Bee. It just sounds like them. But they posted something about, well-meaning liberals certain that the revolution will come for him last, And I think that on that level, I'm ready to actually attribute serious naivete to these folks. But the point that you make about what the Post is and what it represents for our kind of, you call them the discourse ringleaders, right? The Jack Dorseys of Twitter and the Mark Zuckerbergs of Facebook and all of their various minions who write the algorithm, right? It is as we have now said several times, it's a perfectly respectable news outlet. It's also modeled kind of on the British tabloid. I mean, it self-consciously writes these headlines, these front page headlines that, make use of puns and are kind of in and of themselves are these works of art. And it's very, very, self-aware in the way that it engages in kind of smash mouth politics. And so that is enough, I think, to make it look like, in our ecosystem, make it look like a right-wing rag. This is something that people can't sort of people can't underestimate this, and I can't stress it enough myself. I was talking to, I have to credit this to Jeremy Boring, who is the brilliant sort of ringleader of the Daily Wire. And he was pointing out to me that, Facebook basically caved to these woke demands a while back that they should make public the money that people are spending on political content. And so they created a public database where you can go and look up, well, if Ted Cruz targets, milkmaids in Georgia or whatever, then they are going to let you know how much money Ted Cruz and his various PACs spent on that. When they did that, in their kind of constant effort to gesture toward neutrality, they wrote in very vague language what it is that they will need to disclose. And the Times was folded into that because they are nakedly political. They do often publish stuff. I mean, their editorial board just published this full package, this suite of articles about how terrible Trump is, how we hate him, how, we would never publish anything like this except that he's this exceptional president. And so, of course, the Times ended up having to report some stuff under that. The New York Times ended up having to report some stuff under that new Facebook rule, which they moaned about. They said, well, we are objective journalism. We just report the facts, and we're not a political outfit, so we shouldn't be included. Whereupon Facebook Facebook caved again and made an exception that kind of just allowed the Times to spend whatever money it wanted without having to disclose. The Times spent $3 million on 3 posts, all of them about the 1619 Project, which is a factually inaccurate and studiously political effort to undermine the American regime.
Also a racist.
Also racist, right? Also a a purely racialist account of American history. This is an amazing story to me. I mean, it tells you exactly how the dynamic that you're describing, David, works. That the people who will openly decry American principles and do their level best to teach young people, to put curricula in schools that teach young people that America itself is fundamentally evil. Those people are setting themselves up as politically neutral so that they can be protected by the big tech algorithms that exist to protect them. Meanwhile, outlets like the Post, which are openly kind of, opinionated, which have a point of view, but which also report very important news stories, are without protection against this form of censorship. So I think that's a really interesting dimension that you raise, that, just exactly what kind of outlet they are.
Yeah, I also, the other maddening thing, this is again a Soreb tweet, who's an editor at the New York Post.
Yeah.
He says, well, the Ayatollah Khomeini is blissfully tweeting away. I mean, look at the cesspool of Twitter. Look at the foreign actors. I mean, you can get real. This, it's inescapable. This is what, it's hard for me to talk about this in a level way, but one cannot escape the ideological and political bias that was behind the decision to freeze out the New York Post from Twitter and the story. When one sees the foreign actors that Twitter blithely allows to play around on Twitter, and the other hyper-partisan press, the sensational press. I mean, Page 6 is allowed to mess around. It's just anybody else. Just all of the joke rags you can think of in the world,
right,
are allowed free reign right now as we record.
Yeah.
But the New York Post, with a well-researched story, and the Hunter Biden's laptop, incidentally, for those listening, is now with the FBI. That's all true, and so, but they can't exist. So I don't understand how to even talk about this rationally.
Well, Max Boot, famous, notorious Never Trumper, is out there shilling for the CCP. I mean,
that's right. He did. I saw that.
Yeah, a ton of people are saying are talk about spreading disinformation, right? I mean, the CCP, we know the CCP has lied about its coronavirus numbers. We know that they've done everything in their power to keep journalists from revealing what happened in Wuhan that created this just worldwide snafu. And there are people right now, again, as we speak, on Twitter saying, well, China hasn't had a new death in however many days, which like
they figured it out. You just launder it. Yeah. All you have to do is launder the lie through. And for listeners, This is how it works. I live in Washington and Spencer is Washington adjacent. But since we're in politics, we know how this works. But just like a mafioso may launder his money, the left is good at laundering their content through the left and foreign actors. So if the Chinese want good cover, or the Saudis, let's say, to use an example that actually happens, they will gift the Brookings Institution millions and millions of dollars. And the Brookings Institution is a well-known think tank. I'm just using them at random, though there was an interesting article about their foreign donors, so you can look that up. I don't know if it was Qatar or the Saudis. I can't recall. But if you were a foreign country, you donate to a respectable think tank. The think tank would put out a few policy papers, and those policy papers would then in turn be quoted as fact by a Washington Post or New York Times reporter, and you're off to the races. And your fingerprints can't be seen. And then the public just kind of accepts, okay, well, this is it must be the case because New York Times reported it and their source was Brookings, and hey, those guys are top flight. And this happens every single day. So people need to be aware of it. That's all.
Yeah, I wish we had our buddy Nick Short around. Tam Chad Nick, as we call him. He runs our social media accounts. Very, very skilled social media engager, and knows some of the folks at Facebook and Twitter, and has spent really his adult life, his professional career, understanding the ins and outs of how conservatives receive this kind of what do you want to call it, of discrimination, really. And he's frequently pointing out to us the ways in which stuff that is presented in this hyper neutral way is actually, only ever happens to conservatives, at which point, of course, the lady doth protest too much. And this is something, the sheer just, how to even put it, the fecklessness of Republican legislators on this is beyond description. I mean, Dave, you and I were talking in another segment, which folks are going to have to subscribe to the forthcoming Substack to listen to. But we were talking about young conservative frustration with establishment republicanism. And if you really want to know what those guys are talking about, if you're still not sold after the Trump era on sort of this youthful energy on the right that says this hasn't worked for us, kind of, outdated Reaganite consensusism hasn't worked for us. If you want to know why, just have to watch the ways that Republican lawmakers gestured toward dealing with Jack Dorsey and Twitter after this event, after they started censoring the New York Post. Everybody was said, we're going to call them before Congress. We're going to have a hearing. We're going to think about what to do about this.
Get ready, Jack. You had well-known senators tweeting. That's right.
Oh, yeah. And so they did that. And then the minute that happened, my Twitter feed blew up with these kind of already jaded young conservatives saying, I can tell you right now what's going to happen. They're going to back out of this. And sure enough, they've expressed, the kind of what I don't even know what to call them, the kind of like discourse libertarians, the people that just believe this naive belief, right? That the way to foster free speech is to somehow imagine that you cannot touch speech at a federal level. Like you can just take your hands up. The neutrality fallacy, the idea that there's such a thing as a neutral public square. People say, oh, well, if you censor these people, how can you stop other people from censoring other people? And what if people should know. I actually think people should know what the argument is against this. I'm being a little bit snarky about it, but arch, if you will. But the argument against this, of course, is that all institutions, public squares included, exist by operating according to certain principles. And those principles contain within them ideas about the good. And even our, relatively wide latitude for speech has its boundaries and its limits. And we believe they're principled, such as, you can't incite violence against people. And these ideas are not actually neutral. They express values. And so when people say, how can you assert that you should censor, or rather that you should, intervene in this private business, which is Twitter? Well, the answer is, they are a monopoly. They hold a monopoly on eyeballs and attention. It's a new kind of monopoly. I'll grant that, certainly. It's a kind of monopoly that's never existed before, which is that nobody's going to Parler, right? Nobody's going to other news sources to figure out, what's going on. Everybody is aggregating to Twitter. And somebody pointed out recently, when people talk about trying to break up Google, it's like one of the barriers is it's exceedingly hard to build a new Google. Google is actually an amazing product. And so when the people that run that product are doing so according to covert leftist principles, as it has now become clear that they are, you actually have a problem for open discourse. You have a problem for, setting an Overton window within which people can have genuine discussion, because that Overton window is basically dictated by people that think that conservatives are all anathema. So this is, but anyway, this is a kind of digression en route to saying conservatives completely, as always, Republican lawmakers completely failed to deal with this, which is very disappointing.
And let me just, to end on a darker note, if this is what things are like when conservatives control the executive and the Senate, good luck, people. Because if Biden wins and the Senate is lost, or even if Biden wins, use your imagination, extrapolate from this point here what can occur with respect to your free speech.
Yeah. This is a reason why your framing of this as a trial balloon rather than as what I was calling it, which is kind of an unmasking, is the right framing. The trial balloon framing is right because Biden and our kind of chairman Tom Klingenstein has been very good about this, about admitting Biden may or may not be fully invested in the rhetoric of systemic racism and the ideology behind BLM, the movement, and all that. However, he's shown himself to be fully captured by it, right? Fully captured by an insurrectionary left, which genuinely believes. It's funny. I was just in Pennsylvania and I was giving this speech about why I'm voting for Trump, why in fact, after having voted shamefully for Gary Johnson in 2016, I've moved since to be a staunch Trump supporter. And one of the things that I mentioned is, when we say that there's a regime crisis in this country, when we say that there is like the immediate thing is, well, isn't that a bit alarmist? Aren't you using very strong language to suggest that there's a revolution going on? To which my answer was, it's a technical term. It's like a description of something that happens. And I had opportunity to reflect again on how, if this weren't something we're all used to by now, we would be shocked to hear talk of systemic racism in America. Because what is systemic racism? Well, it's the idea that the system itself is racist, meaning it's designed to perpetuate white male oppression. If that's so, there's only one conclusion. There's only one, answer to that problem. And if Joe Biden is, wittingly or unwittingly conceding that problem exists, he's opened the door for the only possible answer to systemic racism, which is the unmaking of America. That's right. There's no hyperbole there. There's no alarmism. It's just a description of what the philosophy means. And like the fact that they're tearing down statues of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln is not some accident. It's not like oh, whoops, we just actually, went beyond the bounds of our beliefs. It's like, it is their belief. That's what they believe. And that's what Joe Biden represents. And so, of course, they'll censor conservatives. Of course. I mean, they're talking now about purging conservatives. They're talking about, truth and reconciliation commissions, which is a reference to post-apartheid South Africa. That's the level on which they're talking.
The Tutsis and Hutus, like for countries that have experienced genocide, you have truth and reconciliation commissions.
Right.
It's the rhetoric doesn't match the circumstance on the left. I think it does, as you were arguing, match it on the right. The other thing, I don't want to get too far afield, but
no, go ahead.
I was thinking that the young conservative intellectuals, are kind of like the new punk rockers. It really is counterculture to be a young conservative, totally counterculture. Like, or it's what the early hippies, they wear your hair long and people called you a freak and the jocks beat you up. Well, I mean, try exclaiming loudly and go wear a MAGA hat outside. Just do it in Bethesda, Maryland, where I live, and see how much fun you have.
Wear one at a gay club. I can tell you what'll happen. You'll get decked in the jaw. I've seen it happen,
Wow.
And I mean, so yeah, this is really important. And it's only in the last couple weeks that my thoughts about the election has caused my thoughts about this to crystallize. It's like, knowing one is to be hanged concentrates the mind wonderfully, as they say, in the course of this election, I've been reflecting upon the fact that, okay, so the scenario, since you and I have been working at Claremont Bar and before that, the scenario has been that Trump revealed a well-to-do Democrat-Republican consensus, which involved kind of two different flavors of basically the same thing, namely open the borders, a dollar is a dollar, put the jobs wherever they're going to go, and let the market do its work all over the world, across the board. It doesn't matter if the American middle class loses all of its jobs. They'll maybe we'll give them a UBI if we're Democrats. Maybe we'll train them up to do other stuff if we're conservatives. But basically, it's fine to kind of let China steal our IP and steal our jobs. Also, it's fine for a lot of people to come into the country illegally because look, the lawns are mowed. This. I'm not like. I'm basically summarizing the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal right now. That it's fine to have this huge underclass of underpaid workers taking jobs away from American people because, a dollar is a dollar. Everything, and that consensus, that Hill consensus, was so corrupt and so decadent, and so few of us saw it. Right? I didn't see it. Yeah, I kind of thought I was like living in the Republican flavor of that consensus, because I'm part of the elite, I mean, everybody on this podcast who does this podcast is on some level part of the elite. And that's not a bad word. That's just a description of like, in every republic, there is a group of people that have kind of striven for honors and succeeded in their field. And either those people are an aristocracy, as happens in healthy republics, that is, they are, they actually are excellent. They do excel. Or, as in the case of our rather wounded and sick republic, those people are an oligarchy, meaning they're kind of, largely quite worthless and out of touch, but they hold on to institutional power. So that's what this kind of congressional consensus was. It was it's an oligarchy, and it remained an oligarchy and was an oligarchy. It includes people, I'm sorry to say, it includes a lot of people at think tanks. It includes a lot of consultants and high level business class people. And so Trump revealed that exists. And what ensued was a scramble for many people to find something radical that would go beyond that would just, break open the sort of narrow, and James I think would say televisual. I don't want to speak for him, but that is a televisual phenomenon where you have very few people kind of curating, well, this is the Republican option and this is the Democrat option, and digital blew the doors off of that. So it was like, well, actually there's an entire constellation, an entire universe and galaxy of stuff available to you, and possible stances and ways to approach things. And that's why the alt-right was so dangerous to the establishment, or even people that like were tarred as alt-right, like Vitalists and BAP and all these people, right? And so all of those folks are out here trying to provide some kind of alternative to what looked like the Republican Democrat divide, but was actually just one thing. It was this kind of old, dead consensus. There are leftist flavors of that attempt to rebel, and there are right-wing flavors. I count vitalism as a right-wing flavor, or integralism, right? Trad Catholicism, and you know, there's Democrat progressivism, there's Bernie Sanders, there's this kind of return to socialism. All of this is just like find something more radical that actually blows the door open on the possibilities of our political life. What I am getting to is, I firmly believe that the actual most radical thing, the only radical thing that you can do and say in the context of this rather decrepit political and discourse landscape, is to follow the letter of the American Constitution, to genuinely believe in the implications of things like freedom of association. You know what freedom of association means, Bar? It means that our employers could fire me for being gay if they wanted to. I don't think they ever would. I believe they never would. But that is something that if you say that, people pull their hair out. That's what freedom of association is. That's one of the things on which this country is founded. It's always the most radical thing. It shocks everybody to insist upon the principles of true democratic and republican equality, right? That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator, not by government, with the rights, the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To actually work out the implications of that, as our Constitution does, is the only truly radical thing. That's why we're the punk rockers. That's why we're so out there, you know?
Right. No, I agree. I can't add to that. I like that.
All right. Well, in that case, let's talk about Jeffrey Toobin.
Toobin. Oh, to go from the high to the low.
From the sublime to the pedestrian, from the sublime to the profane. Yes. Unless there's anything else that you want to say before we do.
No, my mind has already clicked over, Spence. I can't return to anything. Yes, sublime.
You are like, do you know Up That Dog, where it's like, you are my master and I love you, squirrel? Like that's what it is.
Yeah, that's exactly. Toobin
is the Jeffrey Toobin subject, and you're like squirrel. But let's talk about Jeffrey Toobin. Oh my God,
CNN commentator, New York Magazine writer, legal analyst. That's his background.
Yes. I mean, honestly, to be perfectly frank with you, like my familiarity with the
I know what you're going to say. Yeah.
Moment, right?
Yeah.
Zero. Yeah. So actually, do you want to tell the story? Like it's, tell
yeah, I'll try. I spent so much time just looking for the pictures online. I'm just kidding. So from it happened in two parts, I think. The way the story broke, I should say. The background is Toobin and colleagues of his, I think people from the New York Times, like Jane Mayer, a few other big names. We were on a Zoom session with, I think, a public radio station maybe, and they were conducting a war game where they each were playing a different character.
Yep.
I think in the American regime, was it an America-based war game? What were they gaming out? Do you remember? I can't remember. Was it election stuff?
I rely on you to know these.
Yeah, it was something like that.
Yeah.
But it was a war game, right? So
yeah.
So in the abstract, he is on a Zoom call with colleagues he knows and a media outlet. And part of the war game involved the participants breaking up into respective groups to discuss things, and then they go back to the game, strategize. And I think during one of the breaks, the first wave of the stories reported that when he came back to the computer, his pants were down and it revealed his genitals to the rest of the participants.
Right.
It was, the story broke by I think Vice Motherboard. So Vice is the name of media outlet. Their Motherboard is one of their specific outlets. I don't know if it was aimed at young people, but Vice Motherboard broke it. And at first it said, well, it's just his genitals were caught on Zoom. It was updated an hour or so later to say that no, he was indeed masturbating.
It's got to be one of the top 5 corrections in the history of American journalism.
It's wonderful.
Literally issued a correction to reflect that he was masturbating.
Yeah. And so there are many directions we can take this conversation. So I think in Toobin, some listeners will know who he is. If they don't, I'm so happy for you. He's not a nice person. He's a sensationalist. He's a whiner. And by public accounts, he's a dishonorable man. He had a child with somebody out of wedlock. He refused to acknowledge the child for many years and then was forced to after a paternity test.
I did not know that.
So that's the kind of fellow we're talking about. If it was anybody else, I would say, well, to feel a compulsion to masturbate in front of colleagues and strangers is a terrible, it must be terrible, like a tyrannical impulse must overcome because you have so much to lose. You know, it's just a terrible, shameful thing. With Toobin, it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. But we still don't know the details. I guess what I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, Spencer, is imagine this happened to any conservative.
Yeah.
We were already seeing mea culpas by some of his colleagues saying, oh, whoever doesn't masturbate on Zoom casts the first stone, like things equivalent to that.
It's like,
this is amazing. In the Me Too era, this is what the argument is.
I know. It's like, I am a big advocate of that story. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone, but I will actually cast the does not masturbate on Zoom stone. Like, that is not something that I think people in general do. And like, oh gosh. Okay. So there's so much here because as you're talking, I'm thinking about the Me Too movement, which is one that I was back in the day, much like coronavirus lockdowns, like back in the day when coronavirus lockdowns were 15 days to slow the spread.
That was a good one.
Yeah. Remember those hundreds, remember hundreds of days ago when it was 15 days to slow the spread. So back in that day, I was sort of like, well, okay, this is not how I would handle this situation if I had the levers of power in my hand. However, as a dutiful citizen of America, I will go along with this and trust, my federal leaders and so forth. Quickly, of course, it became clear that that trust was at best misplaced. And I felt the same way about Me Too. It was like, oh, like Weinstein's actually a terrible person. And this is a serious bloodletting from some of the worst power centers in Hollywood. And I do not doubt that there are many as yet unrevealed such centers that contain horrors untold. I mean, I can't begin to fathom what they must do in those parties, not far from where I'm sitting right now, right? Not far from my home in Midtown, where, talk about the kind of weird class striation, right? Like my home is one outside of which you can see riots happening. And, not 20 minutes from here, I'm sure there is decadence beyond my imagining going on that has yet to be uncovered by the Me Too movement. But that actually speaks to what I'm getting at, which is that when Weinstein came out, I was like, okay, Me Too, like maybe that's a thing. Maybe that's a bipartisan thing even. Maybe that's something that we can all get behind. Like there's a lot of sexual decadence, a lot of sexual malfeasance in our society, having mostly, I would argue, to do with the unhinging of American sexual norms in the late 19th and early 20th century that accompanied women entering the workforce in these vast numbers. And then, nobody quite knew what to do with like male sexuality and how to restrain it and all the rules that had been invented around it that had to do with the workplace being like a male place. And so, yeah, like we never really sat down and thought seriously about how we were going to keep male sexuality in check, how we were going to channel it in this new world. And so now all of this terrible energy has built up and I'm ready to have a reckoning about that. I'm ready to talk about how to right new sexual rules. But of course, it immediately became clear that there were only really two dimensions to the Me Too movement. One was shaming men for having sexual desire, and the other was getting Republicans. And everybody's red pill moment about this was Kavanaugh, right? That they just took all that Me Too energy, some of which was legitimate, energy from women that had suffered terrible things in the workplace. They took all of that and they just like aimed at this obviously innocent man, with a bogus case that defamed him in front of his family and the entire country. And so everybody was like, at that point, was like, well, this is not a thing,
Right.
But left in the lurch was just like all of this reflection that we could have done on sexual ethics in our society. And like, Bill Cosby, Louis C.K., we were talking before we started recording, like, okay, so these are people with a lot of power and money, men with a lot of power and money. Like, to be blunt about it, those kinds of men can have a lot of women if they want them. They are not suffering for the ability to get voluntary sexual intercourse from women. So obviously, there's something really sick going on here. There's some genuine brokenness and perversion about their desire to force people to watch them masturbate or whatever. The Jeffrey Toobin thing is this kind of apotheosis. It's almost, it's like you couldn't write it into a novel. It'd be too obvious. This allegory of like masturbatory media personalities, like literal masturbation happening, by this person whose whole job is to metaphorically masturbate. Like, you could go off on that tangent. But what I'm more interested in is the BuzzFeed article that then came out, right? Like, Jeffrey Toobin, I'm reading the headline now. Jeffrey Toobin can't be the only person masturbating on work Zoom calls.
Wait, that's really the headline?
Yeah. And there's been more like that. You can find them on Twitter, right?
Yeah.
Like, you probably do it too. Which, like, oh my gosh, there's so many ways that that's a dumb argument. Like, one is like the argument that it's okay to masturbate is not the same argument as you can force people to watch you, unsuspecting people to watch you masturbate, right? Like, and like, it's like when you say it out loud that way, it's so funny that like that's what the left is going for here. But it is, because they're defending their guy. They think of him as an indispensable player in this election, and they're like, we've just got to get past it. The people on The View, the women on The View said similar things about like Bill Clinton, right? Like, I don't care.
Oh yeah, well,
right. I mean, Clinton is like
Clinton was he paid. I can't talk about this for too long.
No, you get mad. It's
upset, but I mean, yeah, he settled out of court for rape charges in Arkansas. I mean, how the hell is this a real thing? I mean, I don't understand this. I mean, I do understand this.
No, I mean, if you go back and read what people wrote about Bill Clinton during the Me Too era, not even don't leave aside what the excuses they made for him at the time. But just when this big national reckoning was happening, the way that they talked about Clinton was like, well, we should probably talk about Bill Clinton too, like this serial like abuser, clearly, right? Or at least serial abuser of power. It was like, yeah, we should probably talk about that. That makes it a little bit uncomfortable. But also, like, look over here, look at Kavanaugh, like that.
Monica Lewinsky was wonderful and heartbreaking to follow on Twitter.
Oh, yeah.
During the early parts of Me Too. Because she's like, hey, guys. And then just by name, a few good conservative writers started pulling the tape of now high visibility leftists in their 60s and what they said about a young Monica Lewinsky tearing down that poor defenseless woman, calling her, a whore. And it's just unforgivable what they do, what they did to this, essentially a child. Yeah. Then at the Clintons' behest and their own just kind of the savagery of their own souls too. It's not like the Clintons could control everybody. These people have autonomy, but now it's no. And so to come back with Toobin and start to excuse, do you really think, Spencer, it's because he is so invaluable to CNN? I didn't.
It's because he's a leftist. And you could find a more sophisticated way to categorize him, but it's because he's a Biden voter, right? He's an obvious like Biden asset. That's I believe seriously. Look, Hillary Clinton was running for president when we were all supposed to be reconsidering the way that we regard sexual abusers and those who defend them. And we were all resurfacing these hideous quotes of things that she said about being on bimbo patrol, right? Like about trying to shut down the women that were accusing her. Like we all knew that was happening. Remember how Tara Reid exists?
Yeah.
Remember how there is a much more credible like accusation of sexual abuse against Joe Biden than there ever was against Brett Kavanaugh, ever, you know, like remember all of that. So like, that's the outrage. And the double outrage of it is that like when men, I don't care if you're gay or straight, when like men hear about men abusing women sexually, they want to punch a wall and then like just do unmentionable things to that man, right? Like that is like one of the most visceral responses you can have as a man to like the misdeeds of another man. Like anyone with even like a shred of virtue. This is what I'm saying. Like it's not extra credit. Like you don't have to be particularly virtuous to respond to stories about sexual abuse with visceral fury. And so to weaponize that noble reaction in service of this nakedly political psyop is just like the lowest possible form of cynicism you could imagine. It's so appalling. But yes, I do think that there is a dedicated rhetoric around making this only ever about conservatives. And the fact that Toobin is who he is totally shapes the way that BuzzFeed writes about him. And also the way in general that we write about sexuality, which is like increasingly permissive in some horrifying ways.
Oh, right? Yeah. No. This is good. No, go on. That's right.
I mean, we talk now about things that would have set our forefathers' hair on end.
Wasn't there, Spencer, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I just don't want to forget. Wasn't there recently a legislation passed or attempted to be passed in California that somehow was like favorable to sex abusers of the young or something like that? I read it and I was like, what the hell is going on?
I'm glad that you've raised this because it actually is something that in as many channels as possible, we should set the record straight on how this works. So what happened is it was discovered that there are prohibitions against sex between people with age different, like majors and minors, right? Basically, people at the age of consent and people beneath the age of consent, which apply to certain sex acts and not to others. And therefore basically favor straight people. Like basically you can do certain things with you could at the time do certain things with minors that straight people do and not do those things that do things that gay people do.
Gotcha.
So the reaction to this, instead of the natural response, which is, well, you should raise the age also of those gay sex acts because gay people have become a staple of modern society. It was like, well, we better lower the age. We better equalize this. We better lower the age of gay sex acts too. So it was like, so it basically turned into a like one step closer to normalizing pedophilia bill when it could have turned into a like moral
strengthening. That's right.
Yeah.
But back to your point on the slide, I think the slide it's real. Look at the, again, I apologize for interrupt. I have so many thoughts on this. I used to watch this show with my wife on the Learning Channel, which has a nice name, but it's rather it's a channel devoted to kind of exploiting people that are very small or very tall or just kind of like outliers. And this is physical outliers in our society. They had one show called Sister Wives, and now there are multiple shows devoted to bigamous families.
Yeah.
And then there's shows devoted to trans kids. I mean, kids, man, not like, oh, I'm in my 20s or I'm over 18 and I'm considering it's a trans surgery. It's like the show called I Am Jazz.
Yeah.
That show premiered when this young girl, I mean, she was a girl, dude. She's like 8 or 9. And so, yeah, you're damn right that this is becoming normalized. And people that want to say, oh, these are just stuffy conservatives. I mean, I can't agree with that. Just take a look at what's on television.
Oh my gosh. Well, do you remember that Joe Biden at his freaking town hall was like receiving questions from the parent of an ostensibly trans 8-year-old?
Oh, that's right.
8-year-old?
Just last week. Yeah.
He then launched into this story. If this story is true, like, I've got a Great Wall of China to sell you. Like, if this is the facts, then I will just quit. I'll quit my job. I'm telling you right now, I will quit my job at Claremont. I will I'll retreat into a cave and never speak to anybody again. Like, Joe Biden then launched into this story about how his dad in something like 1954. I mean, it was genuinely like, because Joe Biden is 1,000 years old, so it's like a long time ago. And like, he launched into this story about how his dad and he were out and they saw two men kissing or hugging or something. And his dad was like, look, man, like, they just love each other. Like, so love is love, you know? And then he was like parlaying that into this 8-year-old boy should be able to have hormone replacement therapy, which, by the way, is a completely offensive thing to do, to like lump in it's okay for two men to kiss with it's okay for a like 8-year-old child to have his puberty delayed. And we've developed, we like the left has created this absolutely insane idea that you can give hormone blockers to a pubescent child. And then if they decide later on that they want to be a fully normal adult, they can just go off those hormone blockers.
I think that people that do that to children, that should be, I don't understand how that's not.
Those people should be
classified as
thrown into the sea, and
severe child abuse.
Family, right, their families.
The children should be taken from them. Those doctors, whoever administered that, should be stripped of their medical license. I mean, it's very ugly, dark. That's very dark stuff. Yeah, and I can't believe it was just put on stage as like a totally normal. And since it's all a DNC op, let's just be clear that this was a question that the people that control the Democratic Party thought would be useful to plant in the audience. So that's the mentality.
Yeah. And, you know, we're kind of coming up on the end of our time. So I want to like wrap us up here. Yeah. I mean, it turned out that Jeffrey Toobin was actually a very fruitful topic of conversation, not to use a like loaded word, but and loaded is also a loaded word. But so I do want to kind of wrap, because we've said some, I think, really important stuff here. Like, the operative question in this conversation has been, is this all just political? And the answer is like, absolutely yes. You know, one of my great frustrations is that the slippery slope people now look great. Like, all the people that said, like, if we allow gay people to even like walk out of their doors, like, then the apocalypse will come. Like, because of what the LGBTQ left has done, like, those people look so good. They seem to have predicted exactly what would happen, because now, like, lumped in with, you know, these adult people who feel that they are, you know, basically constitutionally attracted to, not just sexually attracted to, but like fall in love with members of the same sex. Like, those people are somehow on a team with the folks that want to chemically castrate children, right? Like, that is what is most appalling. And so, yeah, that is political. That is an attempt to build the biggest possible coalition of misfits that can reject the American regime, right? That's an attempt to say anybody that even remotely doesn't fit into the standard model of one man, one woman, and children, or white people, right? The standard model is conceived of in this kind of deranged leftist philosophy, is conceived of as like a white family with 2.5 children. Anybody that doesn't fit into that can understand him or herself as oppressed, no matter whether the way in which you don't fit into that is like you're Jewish or you're gay or you're like kind of a little bit on the outs, or you're like a crazy person, like a polygamist, bisexual trans person, right? Like all of that stuff gets like lumped into one thing. Why? Because the more people can feel that way about America, feel as if America is their enemy, the more people the more voters the Democrats will win to unmake the country. That's what this is all about. It's the only thing it's ever been about. It's never been about gay people. It's never been about black people. It's never been about trans people. It's never been about a single one of the supposedly oppressed folks who are actually completely welcome in America, who are actually doing fine, right? But if they can be made to think of themselves as part instead of the oppositional coalition, then they will vote for this doddering puppet, Joe Biden, and Joe Biden will usher in like this host of revolutionaries to destroy the greatest country that has ever existed on the face of the earth. So anyway, nobody should fall for it. That's all I'm saying. I think we're out of time and we should probably stop. Anything else before?
No, that was good, man.
All right. Well, bro,
second it.
Great. Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful.
I'm Spencer Clavin, assistant editor of The American Mind. David Barr is with me, managing editor of The American Mind. And we will see you again next week on the Roundtable.
Stay safe.
Oh, wait. Subscribe to things. Subscribe to this podcast. And also
donate.
Give us 5-star reviews and donate money. Yes, these are all things that you should do. If you like this content, you will get more of it if you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, Apple, Google, Stitcher, etc. And you should leave us a 5-star review, or at the very least, if you don't like it, you should keep it heck to yourself. All right. Now we're really done. That's the end.